Yeah, we decided that rather than doing this as a seated event, we really want to move through and sort of think through the images as sort of points of crossing, points of intersection, think about questions of belonging and unbelonging, and it just felt like really to kind of almost do that together while moving through and spending time in the show with specific images, having some readings up close. So that's how we're going to go about this. I wanted to start really also with the title of the exhibition, and there's many ways in which that the title could be interpreted. Almost sort of, to me, it beyond the sort of linguistic term, it feels also very conducive to what is happening here in terms of a slow accrual, and it sort of feels as if this space particularly has also been a sort of junction and an editing table in itself, where things also become recursive. So I'm going to leave it there and let you.
Yes. I don't know, I think titles are always very complicated thing, and also something very creative, because you want to almost like zip the whole idea in one small thing. And while I was walking in this show, I just realized that it reflects how I have evolved as an artist in the last 20 years, and how I always went back to the city, and how I came back with something else. And the room where we are now, this work, I think I have started around 2001, when I was just starting to learning how to look through the prism, and still I'm going back to the same place and actually looking at the same space very differently. So the work has developed over across almost like 2 decades, and I think in my practice also this whole idea of developing something slowly, bit by bit, step by step is very important. And also it has many chapters, many shifts, many changes. So the exhibition, all the black and white photographs you are seeing was the starting point, of course, and I published a book in 2013 called Belonging. But after publishing a book, I felt that there were so many things were missing, and from there I produced this film called Khayal, which you see in the other room. And when I have done Khayal, I thought it gave me a very different vantage point, because I was really listening to the sound of the city. And then I started again going back to the city and start photographing. That's why this work also named Stereo, because it has these 2 wavelengths, which gives you a much wider depth of how I have looked at the city. So yeah, it talks about different sort of transformations as an artist, but also how the city has shifted over the period of time.
Yeah, and I think when we go into this idea also of stereo, and we can talk about that a bit more, these sort of wave-like forms and formations of stereo versus mono, obviously this way in which recursivity, because that's something I kind of want to come to more, because it's sort of the work hasn't necessarily been written about in that way, but when we think about history making in the city, there are these echoes and bleeds and slow returns, phantoms, and the recursive image is something that is a way that the city shapes images, images shape the city.
Yeah.
In ways that continue to defy the kind of heavy chronicling of these spaces, right? Whether it's Bombay or Dhaka, we know that there's very hegemonic ways to chronicle these cities, to sort of stamp and clamp down on certain ways of inhabiting them. And that is so apparent in these series, and also particularly in some spaces I observe that are kind of by-lanes and passageways, and that you just by looking and traversing them repeatedly almost turn them into these kind of expansive spaces. They kind of become these echo chambers, right? And that there's a sort of politics of inhabitation in that. It's not something to be sort of just assumed. I don't see it just as a sort of a formal tactic. I really see it, and we've talked to another wonderful photographer, Akinbode Akinbi, about walking the city. So yeah, I want to think through, you know, these ways in which that mode of walking the city, of expanding certain spaces that are otherwise become eclipsed in some ways also.
Yeah, I mean, you know, these old cities also are quite overloaded with a lot of stereotypes, ideas about certain form of architecture, certain form of history, certain form of food that are known from outside, certain forms of traffic. But for me, these places were, these certain places of these cities were almost like zones, and zones which inhabits a different kind of energies and spirits. And it has those spirits because certain kind of people are still able to live there. And they're mostly people who lives a very particular kind of life with special characters. And there's a certain sense of theatricality how they live there. But also there are amazing kind of silences, and that's how also the exhibition is designed. Like right now the film is not playing, but when you walk from one street to other street, you listen different forms of sound, and that sounds tells you actually what's happening inside the houses. A lot of things you don't see, but actually you feel either through smell, either through how you look at it. Also there are a lot of violence in these places, and there are a lot of also intimate spaces, intimate public spaces, where people still have time to breathe and imagine. And for me, those small pockets were very, very interesting. And and I also feel it's not a static thing. It's like constantly changing. A lot of things I have photographed is not there anymore, but there are also new things.
I just want to walk towards that. Obviously, one can start at different points, of course, but when coming yesterday, just during the install, I was really struck by this corner in particular, in the way that there is something when you talk about like violence, but also the kind of there's a kind of eeriness, there's a certain kind of jaggedness, an uncertainty, knowing that this image can sort of culminate into a very different moment, a very different striking, pulsating moment. And there's certain ways in which also the framing, there's the idea of a looming threat is something that really struck me. And that threat can be political, the threat can be something very, very viscerally felt in the body. It could be different things. But the way that, that pulsates through a sequence of images, that's the element that I'm really drawn by. And that's why I also see this as an effort to re-edit, resituate a body of work that has gone on for so many years.
I think you pointed out something very important. So I think in my practice, the work actually evolves in the editing table. Either it's a film, or it's a photograph, or it's a sound. And I think through editing, we give it a meaning, we give it a form, but we also look at these ideas of accidents, and we look at this idea of something that all of a sudden creates raptures in between of spaces. So this image was maybe taken back 12 years back, and this was taken back maybe six months back. But when I was curating this show, all of a sudden I realized that there is some very interesting link in terms of form and also in terms of content, but how you place them next to each other and how you also give space and leave space where there is a space for subtext. In Bengali we call, there is a word called ujjo, which means that that you say something but you also don't say many things, and the things you don't say, that becomes actually more prominent. So for me, this in-between spaces are the spaces where the work happens. As Natasha said about scores and sound, I'm really interested in the idea of musicality, but musicality that's not pronounced, musicality that you can understand through silences by, I don't know, by text, by form. So if you look at the sequence of this whole work, you will see there is a sense of flow, either by the characters or by the lines or by the form or by the stories. And those flows are also quite subtle. And for me, those notes are the most special thing that binds the work together. And that's what we do for a long time. That's core of our practice that I guess a lot of people don't see in general.
Yeah, and even even sort of this idea that has also been written about so much of the punctum. I mean, the punctum, could be situated again at different points in such a series. But like when I look at this this particular image, also the way that it's sort of sitting between this sequence of black and white images, the Tower of Cards. I mean, it's such a prototype of sort of the kind of unraveling into chaos, into destruction, and it's sort of, and yet it's obviously it's held together as this kind of energetic sign, one of the oldest signs, the triangle. So it's also a figure of power in a way. And when I think about that as a possible kind of punctum, perhaps, in relation to reflecting into that wall and that sort of idea of stereo, I realize that that the construction and the deconstruction is happening in parallel. There's a lot of tension between the construction and the deconstruction. We are not ready yet to give into a time of a complete loss of hope or complete unraveling into chaos. There's something else that's happening that you're tapping into, which I think is again very, very significant. Also for other subtexts of what's happening in our region. And so in that wall, I think that wall of work, there were two moments that we wanted to sort of stay at. So we're going to walk towards that series.
Yes. So if you look at this combination or composition of images, it doesn't have the straight linearity. There are many different kind of images, and for me that's also something, I guess, core of my practice, because I also teach and I curate, and I have actually looked at the world of images for quite some time. So for me, sometimes I also has a big distance with my work, and I look at it little objectively. So a lot of my quote unquote images that people know about this place is not in these exhibitions, because those images has much more higher weight. And the moment you see those images, it completely distracts you how you look at the work. And and also I guess in recent times I'm also interested in the whole idea of sculpture, found sculpture in mundane spaces, and how you also translate those 3D things in 2D spaces, in prints. And that also talks about, in generally my interest about architecture, but architecture which has relationship with people who lives there and how they change these forms of architecture. I was also constantly interested in different kind of interventions and changes in the city, from plastics to lights to metals to electronic watches, to all of a sudden, before even we realize, we have found out that nobody wants to give you any more glasses. Everybody wants to give you plastic cups. And this shift happens so silently that all of a sudden you realize, you feel like everything has shifted. So I was also interested on, I guess, that sort of material, yeah.
And if we go into sort of this sequence of images, because in a sense, obviously these are sort of inanimate in objects, but you call them also kind of, they are architectures in themselves. But they all, to me, they're also kind of like fragmented bodies.
Exactly.
And again, because you literally feel traces of the body, and particularly the laboring body, within these formations.
Yes.
And we were also thinking yesterday about why the idea of infrastructure in certain cities in the world, it seems to have a sense of stability. It's sort of like, okay, infrastructure is there, it will be present, it will remain, it has this sort of, at least this assumed notion of perpetuity. But in many other sites in the world, that there are infrastructures which again are in this kind of construction deconstruction mode. They are meant to be ambient infrastructures because they're meant to be used differently, or that space is meant to be used differently by day and by night. And I'm really sort of curious in the way you trace those, you know, even the connection between this glass and the mobile phone. It's a kind of a ambient infrastructure just in my head. I mean, but also, like, you know, this just again the way in which some of the ways in which you're kind of dipping in and out of these scenes. Like your lens is also really heavily shifting from, you know, in terms of just the way that you are chronicling these particular kinds of sets of formations. So could you maybe go into
Yeah, I think I was also fascinated with this whole idea of, I don't know how to say it in English, in Bengali, it's not a Bengali, we have this word called getis, which means, imagine if a leg of a chair is broken, you give a little bit of brick and you attach it with a tape or something, and it's walking. So there's a constant recalibration, and you don't throw things away, you make them walk. And I found that whole idea of adaptation is also very much rooted to our cities. And and I also wanted to re-look at them in a different way. So you look at this image, you see this hand of this old man, and you see these pipes going through. It actually talks about the same thing, but through different materiality. And for me, that's where in between of these spaces I have spent all these years. So I was really that all of a sudden you have these new gates, you know, which has a certain kind of metal structures, but it still have the, you know, similar kind of light that is transpassing through this hand and through this roti. So I was really interested in this camouflage, this there's things that are not defined, things which are not stable, but it still talks about certain forms of life.
Another thing that struck me when coming to this part of the sequencing was just the sort of very kind of commonplace notion of photography as writing with light, and it kind of feels like you're subverting and kind of playing with that notion, because here the way in which the light appears, the light from this kind of overburdened fridge, or the light that's cutting through this kind of poster advert on haircuts, to the car, the headlights. There's just sort of this, again, this kind of a very sensorial disruption also of the idea of photography as a singular perspective. It's more a space, I feel, of kind of rupture, or also making room for illusions in a sense as well.
Yeah, it's also this idea of artist has a singular perspective, you know, which I think is easy for people to box artists in certain ways so they can read. And while I was working on this show, a lot of my friends told me, do I really need to break this walk and bring all those things together? And I felt like, you know, that's the only reason I actually interested in this city, because the city is completely camouflage. It's completely a mind-boggling space where you can't really tell how it is going to move, but it's always have a rhythm. It's always has a musicality. So I was also really interested in the use of light classically, either through sunlight or through light leaks. But I was also interested in these lights, which are tubes, which are neons, which has different temperatures. But it's still, I think it's also, I think I'm also highly informed by certain kind of filmmaking practice that has always interested me. And I was in Singapore for quite a long time, and I had a Thai artist living with me who was always photographing plastic. And I was like, what you are doing? Like, why you are photographing plastic? But then I realized that's what you see actually there. You know, I don't have grown up with this. And then I think I was also highly influenced by Apichatpong and this whole idea of this a certain form of illuminance in different way. Yeah, so I will say my practice has more link with filmmaking and literature.
Yeah,
rather than
let's come to
quote-unquote.
literature.
Yeah.
Because also there's a work at the back of this wall, but it's a rather narrow space. So we're gonna just pass through it and then go to the film. But it would be great to hear a bit about literature, the role of literature in relation to some of the works, and especially that one. Like we've spoken about the score, the notation. There are. I'm gonna look for a Susan Sontag quote, which is on my phone. So while you start, I'm gonna.
It's amazing, no? Someone can look for a quote while we speak. That also talks about how we have shifted. No, so the work started from these two writers. One is called Akhtaruzzamán Ilyas, who is a Marxist. I should not tell he's a Marxist. He's one of the prolific writers from Bangladesh. And then there's also a writer called Shohidul Zohir. And they have both spent their whole life writing about Old Dhaka, but also not writing about Old Dhaka, where the city became just mere a excuse to talk about different sort of idiosyncrasies, different sort of political interventions, different sort of violence, and different sort of history also, because the cities has these colonial backlogs. You know, you see these British facades, you see this French facade, but you see also this Mughal architecture, and then you see this newly built glass, everything. And my interest about the city actually was highly informed by writings of Ilyas, who used the colloquial language in such a magical form. And after a long time, I realized that he was highly influenced by Latin American literature, and also people like Borges, Marquez. So I guess my main inspiration comes from those phrases where you can really feel about certain spaces in the city through your skin, but you can't trace it. The moment you go there, it looks like a banal place, but the moment he writes about it, you see something else is happening. So how does it work? So I was really interested in those sort of translations and those sort of transformations, like how you really look at banality. Yeah, I don't know. Sorry. Did you find your quote?
My quote, yeah. Well, Susan Sontag's quote. Because I just felt like it sort of sticks in my head in thinking about these. She says, photographed images do not seem to be statements about the world so much as pieces of it, miniatures of reality that anyone can make or acquire. And I really love that miniatures of reality. So again, like you said, sort of these pockets of resilience, of making and unmaking, but that they are not statements, and because of the way in which the sensorial is something that is, and you talked about skin, and I felt like, yeah, this is so crucial in that sense, because even when we just sort of, we can just look at this image, which again is just, I love, where what is being, it's so much about what is being projected back as much as it is sort of projecting forward. This kind of multi-directionality of the photograph, I feel like this, you know, before we go into the film, is a kind of reminder to me of that sort of space, like what kind of chamber of experience is the photograph, to really kind of let go of the idea of its flatness and to sort of really think of it as yeah, this sort of multi-directional projection.
Yeah, so I think this photograph is a very important photograph to also look at a certain form of departure in my work, where at the end I was not really at all interested in images, but I was interested what happens when images leave certain traces either in your mind or in your body. And it took me actually 14 years to realize that I was not really interested in the city. I was interested in, there was certain things happening in my mind when I was visiting that particular space. Yeah, so in last few years, I really start to think how we can really photograph or film things that we don't see. But that exist in a deep manner in our lives. So especially in Old Dhaka, when you go, lot of old buildings are crushed overnight because you are not allowed to break any of the old buildings because it's part of heritage and blah blah blah. But of course, people need to live life and all of that. And a lot of times when I used to go back, I used to just find bricks. And if you even find bricks, you are lucky, because anyway. So on the back there is this walk, which is also linked with the film, where you see a little bit of dust, and you see an architecture of memory of one person who talks about a particular house, 27 Shirishtar Lane. But it also talks about my interest in literature, and what Natasha said very beautifully. I'm interested in this fragmented pieces which is not literally jointed, but you just put them together and it creates different meaning. So the way the text was placed, the text was written almost how I look at images next to each other. Yeah, maybe we can go through that space.
Yeah. So if we talk about Khayal, and maybe more generally, just like coming to the moving image, and again, just really to define that medium in the style that you have inhabited it, because there are other examples of work. So it would be great to kind of just chart what the terrain is for you.
No, when I was thinking about the film, I think first I was really interested in this idea of sound and what sound does to human mind and also to eyes, how you see things. So while I was researching, I was walking with a sound recorder actually to in different parts of the Old Dhaka, and I realized there's always a flow of water going in different places in the city that you don't see. And you only hear it at certain points in night, and when you have a sound recorder, of course it amplifies. And I realized that it's something so powerful that how you can really talk about things that you don't see. And for me also, Old Dhaka is a space where there are also a lot of solitary scopes of people to live a life in certain way. It can be about a very simple man who sells perfumes, walking in different alleys. It can be a writer staying on a top of a roof writing, or it can be about me, you know, who can go back to the city, and the city still has a space for someone like me, you know, who doesn't look at camera as a threat and still asks me, why you didn't came back for such a long time, just sit, have a cup of tea. So the Khyal was formed by these 4 characters who live in Old Dhaka, but they always think about something else. And I think for me, there's this whole idea of being there and being not there was something very special. So that's how the film was formed. Yeah.
And can you talk a bit more about the characters?
Yes. So there are 4 characters. This is Osman Ali. So all these names comes from Ilyas' story. But the characters has nothing to do with the way he looks at this story. So there is Osman Ali, there is Ronju, there is Dadi, which is a grandmother, and there is Nitu, who is a small little child. And they all live in same neighborhood, but actually they don't know each other. And they all frame the kind of Khyal I have in my mind. And also the film has a particular way of editing, and as we spoke yesterday, I was also deeply inspired by how also in Hindustani classical music, especially in Khyal, that you have this one stanza and you repeat it again and again, and it creates almost at the end an abstract sound. And what does the word say at the end? It doesn't have any meaning. So I was also interested in this whole mood of repetition and what repetition does to our mind and eyes. Yeah.
Yeah, I particularly also felt drawn to this this plot in the fact of it that there are these characters who are living in proximity, but they do not know each other. So that again is sort of this this space of tension, of possibility, of being on the edge of. So there is a possible meeting, but it is not a promise. And that is so much the reality of these sort of saturated cities. I mean, I'm seeing people who I forgot live in Bombay, so that it's always possible, but it's not promised that you meet each other. And you know, this is something, when I think about the way that you've kind of approached Khyal, I think about Mary Andon writing on archivability of presence. So again, it's sort of these different forms of shared presence without impinging on each other as sort of static characters who must perform in a certain way. There's a lot of fluidity. There's a lot of kind of you create a space that's quite liberated in comparison to some of the harshness of Dhaka. And I kind of wonder about that. But I also wanted to add in one more word and then, you know, let you sort of complete your thoughts on this. And that is the term riyaz, because there is the act of riyaz going on within the film. So this other temporality of riyaz as a form of recursivity, not repetition, because it's never the same riyaz. So yeah.
Yeah, no, just I will come back to it, but one thing you asked actually was so important. I think the film was also shot in a very particular way where I knew from before that I didn't want to work with a cinematographer. I wanted to look at the film also from a very photographic prism, and that also comes from my obsession about slow cinema, starting from Ozu to Kiarostami, and what happens when the camera doesn't move, and what does boredom means, you know, and how it pushes you to think about these different epistemes. Though in the city there's so much happening. And for me also that talks, it also refers that certain kind of transformation happened within these cameras, where all of a sudden these still cameras became also moving cameras, and with the same functions you can move moving images, but it doesn't have the same weight as film cameras. So why you should treat them as film cameras and act like you are filming, though it has a very core photographic notions. So I was very much interested in this, the idea of staticness and how a photographic film can look like. Of course, we have reference of Chris Marker and a lot of other people in the experimental film history who have dealt with that. But for me, this was also very important that it refers to all these sketches I have done in last 15 years about the city. Yeah, now I forgot what you have asked, sorry.
It's fine, you've sort of, I asked about Riyaz, but
yes.
we can
Move
also move towards there and then
yes,
kind of
and
continue
finish.
the thought. Yeah.
Yes, yes. I actually also love in recent years doing shows our part of the world rather than going to West and showing work and explaining exactly what you said about Riyaz, where you don't have to translate anything and everyone understand within the moment what does it mean. And I think there is something very special about that. And from last 5 years, I started actually looking for only Bangla titles for my work, because I realized that there is so much literature are actually coded or not coded, just blended with how I think or how we think. So just to go a little back, this whole exhibition is related in a way that each work is actually referring to a new work. So when I started designing the exhibition, the idea was to extend these 4 characters you see this film. But of course, there was not enough space. So you see Osman Ali again here, and that's how the work was actually initially formed. I thought about this character who is obsessed about smell. And when I say smell, I don't mean perfumes or, smell in every possible sense. Smell of blood, smell of sweat, smell of pepper, smell of everything. And especially in Old Dhaka, when you shift from one place to other place, if somebody blindfolds you, you can easily tell which area you are in, because there is so much presence of smell. And I started to think about how I can really talk about smell without showing smell, and how someone can be obsessed about smell in 2022. And it also lets me, while I was started researching and especially looking at the Mughal era, that it actually opens up a completely different episteme, and it opens new way of looking at the world, actually, at least for me. So here you will see a lot of spaces, actually, a lot of architecture, a lot of things which are not definite, but still it gives you a reference of certain forms of smell, which is links also with the film. Yeah.
Yeah, and I was also really struck by the image of smoke. So again, this sort of the sort of very strange idea of an image that is vaporous, that is sort of, obviously air and atmosphere is a core ingredient in the making of a photograph. Yeah. But just to actually then sort of situate smoke, vapor, without it becoming something that's ephemeral or just passing through, it's got a certain weight to it in particularly this sequence of images. So yeah, I also again feel like it's a space of haunting, a sort of reminder of fragrances as sort of ways again to think about asymmetrical time, because they are such, like the fragrance of someone that you desire or someone that you fear, it hits you in such a specific way that even if that fragrance comes to you after many years, it has this kind of immediacy about it. And so I feel like these images also perform in that kind of way.
Yeah, also this whole idea of immateriality, that things, when I will do this show in Dhaka, there will be also 2 other chapters. So it's it has this chance of evolving and unfolding in various ways, and that's what I love about my practice, that it gives you fluidity of interpreting thing and recalibrating thing in different ways, and it's not static and it's not dead, so you don't feel like an archive. Yeah. Yeah, good.
We are open for different forms of conversation. It can be super informal. You can just come up and chat, or if you have a question you want everybody to hear, that's also an option.